Every time we read a book, we change. We feel more deeply and think more boldly. Scholastic believes every act of reading has the power to spark positive change and progress. It makes us think more, be more, and do more.
Is in a red car.
Hello everyone. 안녕하세요. 2022년 이퍼블릭과 언어세상의 Teachers Day 이벤트에 오신 여러분 환영합니다. 저는 이퍼블릭의 다이애나입니다.
Hi, welcome to the 2022 Teachers Day event hosted by Language World and ePublic. I am Kelly Kim from Language World.
네, 매년 Teachers Day 이벤트에 참석해 주시는 여러분들에게 감사한 마음을 담아서 올해도 현재에 계신 선생님, 원장님 그리고 저자분까지 모시고 알찬 세션들을 마련했는데요. 오늘은 현지에서 직접 아이들을 가르치고 계시는 미셸 선생님을 특별히 모셨습니다. 조금 더 자세히 소개를 해주실까요?
Today we have brought in teacher Michelle Varghese. She is a veteran teacher with 20 years of teaching experience. Currently, she is a second grade teacher at Richmond Street School in California and also an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University.
네, 저희 미셸 선생님의 리터러시 그리고 현장에 대한 노하우 강의는요, 한번 보면 팬이 되지 않을 수가 없는데요. 오늘은 특별히 리터러시의 명가 스콜라스틱의 헬로 리더스를 가지고 아낌없이 강의를 준비했습니다. 조금 더 자세히 말씀을 해주실까요?
So today, teacher Michelle will be informing teachers and parents on how to engage young readers through interactive reading. Also, she will highlight benefits of modeling reading with expression and fluency to young readers. She will hopefully encourage independence and confidence when reading unknown texts. So basically, I hope she will be using Hello Reader series to do that and basically boost up literacy.
네, 리딩과 리터러시에 고민이 많으셨던 선생님들에게 알찬 시간이 되셨으면 좋겠습니다. 미셸 선생님을 한번 모셔볼까요?
Let's bring in teacher Michelle Varghese.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to share with you some practices, ways to engage your readers in your classroom. My name is Michelle Varghese. This is my 9th year in the classroom and my 20th year in education. I have taught in learning centers for kindergarten through 12th graders. I've taught at the graduate level, and I've taught 8th grade, 1st grade, and 2nd grade. And this is currently my 9th year, as I said, in education, and my 4th year in a 2nd grade classroom. So very excited to be here today. Like many of you, I taught during the pandemic. So I taught virtually during the COVID pandemic. My year and a half of teaching online definitely taught me how to adjust many of my teaching practices. Perhaps like many of you, I felt like a brand new teacher. I had to learn new ways to teach, to instruct, to assess, to meet the needs of my virtual students. And just as I found that I was kind of getting my bearings in this Zoom world, this world of teaching online, whoosh, I went back to the classroom. So there were new adjustments to make, ways to remember the safety and health protocols, teaching only seeing half of my students' faces, right? Most of them were covered by masks. Learning to teach myself through a mask. Maybe like many of you, I felt like a brand new teacher again. Thankfully, what I realized was whether we are teaching online or in person, what really matters is great practices and solid pedagogy. And hopefully, like me, you were just reminded that, you know what? I'm a good teacher. I have great practices. I know pedagogy matters, and I am here to meet the needs of my students. We plan standards-based lessons. We get to know our students and their needs through formative assessment. We give feedback that is timely and meaningful. And today, I hope to share with you either practices that maybe remind you of those good things that you've been doing year after year, or perhaps teach you some new ways to engage those learners in your classroom, particularly through your reading instruction. Here's a brief overview of what I'd like to cover today. I'd like to share a few things to consider during each stage of your reading instruction, before reading, while reading, and after reading. And again, throughout these stages, our focus is really engaging the readers with the text and cultivating that love of reading. So before reading, before embarking on an entire year of reading instruction, I'd like for you to consider your own attitude towards books, toward reading. Your enthusiasm, your curiosity, your love of literacy, your love of literature goes a long way in setting the tone for your students as they go through your reading instruction and devour book after book, or perhaps for those reluctant readers, your enthusiasm is really what's going to make the difference this year in turning that reluctant reader into a reader who just loves what they do and just can't wait to get into that next book. So setting that tone through your example, your enthusiasm is very important. Also, think about before your reading instruction even begins, how do you make reading and the love of reading visible in the classroom? I remember a professor of mine once used the phrase blessing a book, and she talked about how even touching a book or holding it up and saying, "Oh, boys and girls, this is one of my favorite books. I'm going to leave it here up on the board. Anybody who wants to take a glance through it, please come up and take that book during our next reading time or during our next free choice time." Making books visible throughout all parts of your classroom is a really nice way to engage your readers, especially those reluctant ones who maybe reading isn't their first choice during free choice time, or maybe reading doesn't come very easily. Just blessing that book or highlighting it is a really nice way to spark that curiosity. On the slide here, we have Clifford Goes to the Doctor. I'd like for you to consider how books can create relationships between you and your students and between students and each other. Books are a wonderful way for us to share our humanity. Most of us have the experience of feeling a little bit scared before we go to the doctor, before we go to the dentist. So if you choose books that can unite and can find a common thread between your students that could engage those reluctant readers to pick up that book and be a little curious. I wonder if Clifford is nervous before his checkup, just like I'm nervous before my checkup. So highlighting a book, again, in the classroom, or maybe through a read aloud, or maybe just holding it up, even before that book is even open, it can go a long way. Also, before reading, I'd like to invite you to ask yourself where in your reading instruction or where in the classroom during your reading time, where does your student have the opportunity to make a choice? So, first of all, we need to teach children how to choose books. You can model that through your own verbal book walk. I wonder if this book is going to be a just right book for me. Let's look at the cover. Let me open the book and look through a few pages. Is this book going to teach me something new that I'm interested in? Is this book going to make me feel calm before that doctor's visit? So you can model how to choose a just right book. And then even within your lesson, think about where can your students make a choice? Where can they read in the classroom? Not only which books can they read, but how much of that book do they have a choice about reading? Do they have to read every word on the page? Can they share the book with someone? Can they read next to someone? Think about it. Sometimes we overlook all of the opportunities for choices for children. And I just want to call your attention to one of the articles that I have here on the slide. It's written by Alfie Kohn. It was published in Phi Delta Kappan. His article, Alfie Kohn's article, Choices for Children, Why and How to Let Students Decide. This article explains the myriad benefits of letting children have choice in their academic journey. And one of the easiest and most engaging ways is through reading. Again, asking those big questions. What books are your students being allowed to choose to read? Where can they read? How much of the book? Things like that. So consider, even again, before your students open a book, where did they have choice? Where did they have voice in choosing those books? Also, a very important part of your reading instruction before that reading happens is begin with the end in mind. Good teachers, we know this. We think about what will happen after the lesson. How will my students remain engaged? How will the learning continue? Consider how your students will respond or engage with that text after the book is closed. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about this toward the end of my presentation today, but again, it's something to consider even before starting. Perhaps your students will respond with writing or drawing a quick sketch. Perhaps your students will respond verbally. Perhaps it's going to be recorded, and I'll talk more about some platforms that you can use to allow that verbal recording. Perhaps they'll just share with a peer. It could be as simple as turning and talking to a neighbor. What did you like best about that book? Which character did you like best? Or it could be a more complex response. So again, I'll talk more about it toward the end of my presentation, but something to consider even before that book is open. How will your students respond? Now, I'd like to demonstrate how I might allow some choice before reading. So, for example, let's say that I wanted to teach my students about characters' feelings and responses to what happens around them. So I have my lesson in mind. I have the end in mind. I know how they're going to respond. I, as the teacher, I have chosen 3 books that allow me to teach this lesson, allow my students to respond and learn this lesson and respond afterwards. But I have just cultivated a choice of 3. But again, it gives my students some choice. All right, boys and girls, today I've chosen 3 books and you get to make the final choice. I have the Gym Day winner. Let's say that I have a student, or perhaps you have a student who is in a wheelchair and sees a character on the cover who looks like them. Or let's say you have a student who loves sports and a book about being a winner at Gym Day really appeals to them. That could really spark some interest. I have another book. My tooth is about to fall out. Maybe like me, you have students who are obsessed with losing their teeth and getting a visit from the tooth fairy. So this book might be really engaging for them. And third, oh wow, the Saturday triplets in Teacher Trouble. What kid doesn't love to read about trouble, right? So like I said, I have already thought about my lesson, about characters and feelings and how they respond to problems around them. And knowing my library, knowing my books, I can choose some books and then give my students the final say. Which book would you like to read today so that we can learn this lesson? And then they have that choice. Now that we've talked about all of the important things that you will do before reading, let's move on to while your students are reading. So first of all, hooray, we finally get to read. We do so much important work before we read. This is really the fun part. We actually get to read and we actually get to hear our students read. They get to open that book. How exciting. While reading with and to your students, first of all, don't discount how important modeling is. So we've modeled how to choose a just right book, how to do a book walk, perhaps how to make a choice, right? Now, while we read, it is our chance to model fluency and expression. Every time that we read aloud to students, we want to consider how important it is to model that fluency and expression, because what we're doing is teaching our students how a book is supposed to be read. Not only will you, of course, teach skills, some phonics, decoding, comprehension skills, but reading fluently and with expression shows early readers how a text is supposed to be read, and also those really important factors around author's purpose, looking at how the author has included perhaps dialogue and punctuation and special text like italics. Modeling is important for a student's inner reading voice as well. So while you might be modeling reading aloud, what you are doing is laying the foundation for your students to have that inner reading voice as well. As you read aloud, you're also modeling concepts of print. Now, my kindergarten and first grade teachers, you know very well that concepts of print, how we read across a page, we read from left to right, top to bottom, we look at the pictures as we go. All of that is encompassed in modeling when you read aloud. Let's take the pages that we see here on the screen as an example. Now, this is Poppleton in spring. Notice as I read aloud, my fluency, my expression, and also how I take advantage of using the dialogue to really bring the story to life. And I know that some of us have reluctant readers in our classroom. That's just going to happen, right? But with your voice, making that dialogue come alive, you can really spark some curiosity and some engagement with the text. So here I go. let's pretend that you're my students, and here I am reading aloud a couple of pages from Poppleton in Spring. "And look at those thumbtacks," said Poppleton. "I never use them," said Cherry Sue. "May I have them?" said Poppleton. "Of course," said Cherry Sue. "Hey, a box of shoelaces," said Poppleton. Poppleton saw so many wonderful things in Cherry Sue's attic, and she was so nice. She gave him nearly everything. All right, readers, thanks for sharing with me in that read aloud. As you can see, I changed my voice as I was reading for the different characters. I paid attention to punctuation. I paid attention to the italicized part there. All of this is really modeling what I want my students to do when they go off on their own. Because again, our whole goal is to foster independence, right? And readers who can do this work on their own. What I might do after I model maybe a page, I might then give my students the opportunity to read the exact same page and try out their own voices with the dialogue. Parroting reading or reading back exactly what I've just read is a great way to build some independence, and it's a wonderful scaffold. While reading, here's another really important thing to consider. You want to check in with students by asking questions. Questions like, what's happened in the story so far? A story needs to be retold many times. We also might ask questions such as, what new fact did you learn? Perhaps if they're reading a nonfiction text. A quick note, and here's my second bullet point on this slide. Don't mistake a child's correct reading with comprehension. So sometimes, and you probably have experienced this in your own classrooms. I know that I have in my classroom. A student will be reading perfectly and decoding all the words and perhaps even reading with fluency and expression, like a seasoned reader. And then I ask a question and the student says, I don't know, right? So we don't want to mistake a fluent reader or an expressive reader with a reader who's following the story, which is why it's so important to check in with the readers. Again, those questions can be very simple, like, who is the character talking to on this page? Or what color shirt was the character wearing on page 7? Questions that can be found explicitly in the text, or they can be more complex. What do you think will happen next? Why do you think the character responded that way? Your questions can also vary. Close-ended questions or open-ended questions. Some examples here on the slide, some open-ended questions. What do you think will happen next? Engaging your readers' predicting skills or inferencing skills. What kind of person is this character? There's no right or wrong answer. This is an open-ended question that can tell you a lot about a reader's comprehension. This kind of question, backing it up with evidence. How do you know that that character is a nice character, as you say? Or how do you know that that character is grumpy today? That will allow your student to look back at the text for evidence to support his or her answer. Let's take that last slide in Poppleton, where Cherry Sue was so nice. Maybe your student says, she was a really nice friend. You might say, how do you know? Well, because she gave Poppleton the thumbtacks and the shoelaces, right? There are also close-ended questions where your student can point right to the text and answer, why did the main character react that way? Perhaps your reader goes to the text and says, well, he reacted that way because his best friend was really mean to him, or he reacted that way because his mom yelled, or something like that. Where in the story did someone show kindness? Those are close-ended questions. There's one right answer. Well, right here, Cherry Sue was very nice to Poppleton, right here on page 7, for example. Be thinking about those different thinking skills that your students will need to answer these questions. Again, you can vary those types of questions, which you'll do in your reading instruction. Another wonderful way to engage your students while reading is to share the text. This might be one of my favorite ways, especially to get reluctant readers really engaged with the text. Consider active participation and encouraging active participation by sharing the text. You could say, here's my idea. You read one page and I'll read one page, or I'll read one sentence and then you read one sentence. You can even do it with words. Let's say that word by word, that's a victory. That's a celebration for some of your readers. I'll read a word, you read a word, and then we go back and we'll read the whole sentence together. Sharing the text allows your students to breathe a little easier, to not have so much of the pressure of an entire page of print, or perhaps an entire book to be read all by himself or all by herself. There's a lot of work that goes into reading, and when we can share the text, it eases that burden of having to do all of the work by themselves. As a student gains confidence, he or she might be more willing to take on more of that active participation. Here on this slide, you'll see students sharing the text, and some are reading at the same time. In that second picture there, you can see that they're both pointing to words and they're both reading on the same page. On the other page, one student is reading and another has a checklist, and then they swap, which is also a nice way to share the work of reading. On the next slide, you'll see, on this slide, you'll see just a couple of different ways, like I said, of sharing that text. Now I'd like to demonstrate how I might share the text with my students. Speaking of sharing time troubles. Again, with the end in mind, we want to foster independence. We want to foster engaging with the text on their own. Here's a great way. Now, this book is a rhyming book. So I've picked this, let's say, for a lesson on rhymes and onsets and rhymes for my early reading teachers, looking at ends of words and rhyming parts. One of the ways that I can share the text here is I'll say, okay, boys and girls, this book is filled with rhyming words. I'm going to read the first part, and whenever I pause and go like this, I want you to provide a word that you think might finish my sentence. Some of you might see the word in the book, and some of you might just be thinking of what word could fit. Sharing Time Troubles, written by Grace Macaron. Sharing Time Troubles. It's Monday. It is sharing time. Dan brings his pet, a frog named, and here some of my students might call out slime because they see SL, that blend, and they think, what rhymes with time that starts with SL? Slime. Some students might read it and call it out. Some students might even call out something that's not on the page, but they're thinking of a rhyme, like climb, time, slime, rhyme, anything. The important thing here is that I am trying to engage my readers with the text. I'll keep going. It's Tuesday. It is time to share. Pam brings her special. Now here, you've noticed what I've done is I've paused, before a bigger section of text. I'm scaffolding for my readers. I'm wanting them to provide more of the text, something that still rhymes, but perhaps uses more syllables, requires them to read and look at the first letter of the first word that's missing. On Wednesday, Max brings Mexican money. Kim brings gold. Jan, here I've paused for even more of the words to be provided, brings a bunny. Now, again, I might change my strategy for each page, or I might keep just the one word that I want my students to provide. But again, this is just a few different ways that I could share the text. I might do it in a read aloud with my whole class. I might do this with just one student, one-on-one instruction. I might do it with a small group. Another way that you can continue this work, you can then close the book, pass it to a student and say, you and your partner, you keep playing the game of sharing the text. So again, sharing the text is a wonderful way to engage your readers with the text. Now that we've talked about some important ways and engaging ways that you can foster some independence and a love of reading while your students are reading, let's move on to what can we do after reading. So once that book is closed, once your students have shared the text and read with partners, and perhaps you've done your read aloud, whatever your lesson called for, how will your students still engage with the text afterwards? So again, remember at the beginning of my presentation, we talked about beginning with the end in mind. How will my students respond? So let's talk about some options. Your students might write a new ending to the chapter or to the book itself. Again, you thought about, will my students respond in a written format? Will my students respond verbally? Perhaps my students will just share with their partner, like turn and talk about your favorite part. Think about how their engagement with that book can continue even after that book is closed. Do you want to hear their opinion about the main character? Would you like for them to make a recommendation for someone else to read this book? I remember 2 years ago, my students loved this assignment that I gave them, this way to engage with the text. I had them, put on their professional coat and make a recommendation. They felt very professional. I would recommend this book to anyone who likes unicorns, or I would recommend my parents read this book because it's all about how brothers and sisters shouldn't have to eat their peas at dinner and things like that. They had so much fun with it. What I learned was that I could, for this section of my reading instruction, I could combine it with my writing instruction. So my writing unit corresponded to opinions. So my persuasive writing unit, I was able to join with our reading unit and have my students write their recommendations or why they thought that this book was the greatest. What was your opinion about this book? So that was a lot of fun. Consider alternative ways. Let's say that you don't want your students to have to write all their responses. Think about other ways that your students could respond. Could it be verbally? Could it be through a platform online, such as Saw or Flipgrid? Again, my distance learning students loved Flipgrid because it gave them a chance to verbally share their opinions or their recommendations about books, and then their peers, also online on Flipgrid, could respond on that same platform. So they got really engaged with each other online. And, it was one of those things, going back to at the beginning of my presentation, talking about all of these new things that we learned. One of the blessings that came out of that new way of teaching online, I discovered ways that I had not considered before for my students to engage with text and even engage with their peers through reading responses. So that was really exciting. As you can see on this slide, I've got a student writing a letter in one of the pictures. In another picture, I have a student kind of giving a book talk, maybe what we would call a book report, verbally to his peers after he finished reading his book. So lots of different ways to engage with the text after that book is closed. Another wonderful way that I like to continue that love of reading after that book is closed, I always invite my students to do something. So it might sound like, readers, remember, today and every day you can ... It might sound like, you can learn about characters by paying attention to how they respond to problems. Or remember, readers, just like this story taught us a lesson about sharing, you can look for lessons in the other books that you're reading. So it's an invitation to carry that learning outside of just this book, or even outside of the four walls of our classroom. They can look for those lessons in other books. They can look for characters, feelings, and responses to problems in other books. So that's really nice, just as a little note in their mind, like, oh, I could do this with other things too. Offer suggestions possibly about what else they could read. If you liked this book, you might want to try out another book. Don't discount repeated readings. I thought it was so important. I wanted to put this quote by Dr. Timothy Shanahan on this slide. Repeated reading usually leads to better reading performance. The biggest payoffs tend to be with word reading, but it's also been found to improve oral reading fluency and reading comprehension, which was the most frequently reported area of improvement. Sometimes as teachers, we do have a lot to get through, and we want to expose our students to a lot of different kinds of books and genres. But count how beautiful repeated reading can be, and how beneficial repeated reading can be. Here's a little story from my own life. I was born in Germany. I grew up in the States. I grew up hearing German, but not really reading it or speaking it that much. And now when I come across a German book, and I have several in my home and a couple of German books in my classroom, what I find is the first time or the second time or even the third time that I read that book, a lot of what I am doing is decoding and making sure that I'm saying a word right, making sure I know what a word means. A lot of that work in those first readings is not around comprehension necessarily, comprehending the story. It's around figuring out what those words are. The same thing in Spanish. I started learning Spanish in college, and I just fell in love with it. Even today, I will pick up a Spanish book, and the first couple of times that I read this new language, I'm just focusing on saying the word correctly, or making sure that I'm piecing the syllables together correctly. It's not until the fourth or fifth time that I read that then I can get into what the story means. Think about, I offer the suggestion to parents as well. Think about your kindergartners, your first graders, second graders, third graders, all of your readers in your classroom. A lot of times, those first few times reading a book, the work that they're doing, that cognition, is around decoding, and then later they're understanding the story. So, with reason, allow your students to read a book again and again, especially if it's a beloved book. Of course, we don't want our students to stay in the exact same book all year, but it definitely is beneficial to allow them to read and repeat. Excellent. Now I'd like to model how I might ask my students to respond to this nonfiction text. So here's a nonfiction text. It's animal families. Now this is a really engaging text. So many students love nonfiction books. This is a really wonderful one, in particular because of the pictures. They're wonderful. And many students love to read about animals. This is also a nice text for reluctant readers or maybe emergent readers because it's a very predictable text. It follows a pattern. So here we are. Many animals live in groups. The pattern of this book is the sentence will name an animal, name what they do, and then name the group that they do that action in. So here we go. Lions, there's the animal name. Sleep, that's what the lions do. In prides, those are what we call groups of lions. Lions sleep in prides. Wolves hunt in packs. Geese fly in flocks. So the book continues in this pattern, naming an animal, naming the action, and then the group. And then finally, it ends with you eat, sleep, play, work, and live in a family. At this point, I could close the book and say, wow, we learned so much about animal families, and we also heard that we do certain things in our family. I wonder if you know anyone in your family who does something special. Maybe your brother plays soccer on a soccer team, or my sister eats all the popsicles in the freezer. And then I would invite my students to perhaps work with partners or in a group to come up with as many sentences as they can that follow that pattern. Or I might, let's remember a few slides ago when I talked about using my reading unit to correspond to my writing unit of persuasive writing and giving a recommendation or an opinion about a book. What if I used my reading unit from my nonfiction text to correspond to my science unit about learning about animals? I might read just a couple of pages in this book, and then I might close the book and say, scientists, now it's your turn to research one animal and tell me what they do and where they do it, or how they do it, or with whom they do it. And that gives my readers a chance to act as scientists and carry what they learned from their book into their own writing and into their own research as scientists. I might do the same kind of activity with a fiction text. So for example, sharing time troubles, I might have my readers read the book about who shared what, and I might say, ooh, stop in the middle of the book and say, the problem is they were having trouble coming up with what to share. I want you to write a new ending to the book. How would you have solved the problem? So again, just thinking of how do I want my students to respond to this text and stay engaged with it so that the learning continues. Perfect. All right. So in summary, I've shared a few very important actions that you can take in before your reading, while reading, and after reading instruction. That's the things here on this slide. And then in summary, I just want to leave you with 3 closing ideas. The first being voice and choice are powerful motivators, giving your students a lot of choice in how or what or where or with whom they read can be so powerful in engaging them with that text. Second, modeling is essential, whether you're modeling reading out loud with fluency and expression, or you're modeling how to choose a just right book. That is very important. And third, we have to believe, and I know that you believe with me, that every student is a reader. Every student is a reader. And I want to invite you to think, how does that belief show up in your classroom? How does that belief show up in your routines? How does that belief show up in the questions that you ask your students, in the choices that you give them? Every student is a reader, absolutely. And finally, I just want to say thank you so much for being here today virtually. I'm so honored to have been with you. And I do so appreciate your dedication to your own practice and to the students in your classroom. And I hope that you found this session valuable. Thank you so much again.
Is in a red car.
blue eyes. 미야오 미야오 누가 파란 눈이면 고양이겠지. 미야오 미야오.
You may feel 이거 뭐예요? Happy at school.
You can clean its nose.
Clean 하는 거야?
A lion can groom
나무 진짜 잘 산다.
근데 나무 타는 거 귀엽지 않아?
우와.
In fact, these
신기하다, 그치?
playful animals needed to eat more.
아빠가 해볼래
When it was
아니야?
done eating,
아니야, 나비애벌레야.
Inside cool caves.
Mail carrier.
Police officer. Police officer.
Police officer.
애니멀이 뭐야?
동물.
밑에 동.